Okay. So this is going to be a bit of a mind scrambler in some ways. I'm dealing with Merleau-Ponty's later thought, which is quite confusing. And I think he wants it to be a bit confusing. He's trying to challenge some assumptions and some ways of thinking. And so I'm going to encourage you to sort of hold on to your questions for a bit, because I'm going to try to hit things in a few layers and do some different ways of trying to get some points across. So if something doesn't make sense immediately, I would suggest to sort of let it be confusing for a bit and see if through the talk and through the demonstrations, if things get comfortable. I won't say clear. But out of touch, unaffected, unmoved, numb, left cold, removed. Language surrounding apathy takes the form of a lifelessness. Does then the answer to apathy lie in liveliness, in animation? I like to consider the opposite, that in fact developing a response to apathy involves going deep into lifelessness, into the inanimate, and finding a curious kind of life there. I will draw upon the philosophy of Maurice Merleau-Ponty to theorize the life of the inanimate and consider how we might re-educate our senses in order to see this invisible activity and feel this impalpable pulse. Such a retuning of the senses is an ethical call, I argue, and we are culpable for not doing so. In the course of this talk, I will suggest that honey and hammers and wood speak to us of their lives and of a means of enriching and preserving our own. Merleau-Ponty's late philosophy seeks to overcome dualities and hierarchies central to Western philosophy, challenging both the mind-body split and the prioritization of vision over touch. He endeavors to situate humans in a world that looks at us as we feel it. His thought looks for disruptions or breakdowns in both perception and daily ways of being that focus upon the invisible and relish in the unconscious genius of habits. Merleau-Ponty looks at children, artists, and members of non-industrialized societies, and, even less sensitively, those with physical and some sorts of physical and mental disabilities, as calling attention to ways of being and possibilities ignored by and invisible to non-disabled, non-artistic Western adults, which is problematic, I know, but I'll get into that in a second. So here's the longest quotation you'll have during my talk, and I'll read that out loud. So it follows that normal perception must remain open to these abnormalities of which he is never entirely exempt himself. He, this is the Western male, probably French. He must take the trouble to understand them. He is invited to look at himself without indulgence and rediscover within himself the whole host of fantasies, dreams, patterns, and magical behavior, and obscure phenomena which remain all-powerful in shaping both his private and public life and his relationships with other people. These leave his knowledge of the natural world riddled with gaps, which is how poetry creeps in. If you'll allow me to adopt Merleau-Ponty's Eurocentrism and Freudian-inspired language of neurotics, so the normal, quote-unquote, mid-century Western men do not allow themselves to indulge in antisocial fantasies or primitive culture's belief in the magical animation of objects. However, he argues, their often unspoken and always difficult to articulate phenomenological lives defy Western principles of logic and physics. In our phenomenological lives, vision and touch, for example, are not separate senses. So, for example, a blind person's cane is an extension of the body that becomes incorporated into movement. This is an example that Merleau-Ponty gives. The tapping in counter rhythm to the click of the heels vibrates the ground into the hand. The cane also becomes not a substitute for vision, but a kind of vision through feeling. So Merleau-Ponty writes, synesthetic perception is the rule, and we are unaware of it only because scientific knowledge shifts the center of gravity of experience so that we have unlearned to see, hear, and generally speaking, feel. Okay. So he has very distinct views about what science is, and if you read his work, science is always bad. He has a non-complicated view of science, so I'll skip that for for the moment. Synesthesia, this is an important idea for Merleau-Ponty. He wants to say that everyone is synesthetic. If we just sort of descramble a little bit the sort of divisions that we put within our senses, you'll see that synesthetic perception, he says, is the rule. He gives some examples, and I'll look at those a bit later. But the blind person, he wants to say, sees with the cane. That's one way of looking at it. So speaking of unlearning, the choice of words here is telling, as phenomenology is a kind of unlearning for Merleau-Ponty. He chastises, for example, Renaissance artists who worship this idea of the vanishing point, which he says doesn't correspond to reality. If you are in love with Socrates, for example, he's going to be bigger and closer to you than Aristotle, who's looking down at the ground. On the other hand, he's also going to critique Impressionist painting. So this idea, when they started thinking, well, actually, since data comes into the brain, bless you, in these sort of lots of color and so forth. And he says, no, this isn't the way that we perceive reality whatsoever. Actually, we see haystacks, particularly if you made the haystack, you would have a different sort of relationship with that haystack. And in those sense, you're going to get little blots of this and little blots of that. That's overpowering of what we might call this sort of neuroscientific understanding of perception that doesn't really line up with reality, he wants to say. Cézanne, on the other hand, does a better job of it. So he wants to see Cézanne is making artwork that actually doesn't make sense in some ways of looking at pears and apples and things like that. You probably would not eat that, I assume. But he wants to see how the artist is actually using the color to make it pop off of the canvas, actually giving you the roundness of the apple, which is something that you can't do if you follow perspective modes of representation. So he wants to say that felt reality can be quite different from objective reality. Love, grief, and sympathy can annihilate distance in a way that can be difficult to articulate, but I imagine all of us have felt. But I imagine all of us have had moments where we feel much closer to a loved one in need than those who are physically pressed against us. Merleau-Ponty holds that it is in some ways more robustly true to say that your loved one is near, that you are there beside them, than to say that you're closer to those who are near you on a train. So here I'm imagining somebody coming back from a hospital, just having visited their loved one. And there's a sense in which the loved one is very much there with them. Or conversely, you might say they're very much present with the loved one. The people around them are scenery. Physically, they're pressed against them, but in a sort of phenomenological sense that Merleau-Ponty is discussing, they're not. A gift. Yes.
What does it mean, phenomenological?
Okay, sorry. This has to do with
what I can sense.
It's a description of your senses that might defy ideas of logic and either or sorts of thinking, right? So you're both there and somebody else. The person is both far away from you and they're with you. And it's important for Merleau-Ponty to sort of gobble up everything. Even if it doesn't make sense together, even if it sort of makes you have commitments that don't make sense together. Yeah. And for him, phenomenology is just a process of analyzing that and describing it, putting it into writing in terms of philosophical phenomenology. So a gift of phenomenology to Western ways of thinking is allowing for the ambivalence and showing the flux within hierarchy and stratification. Near and far, question, I guess. Mind and body, animate and inanimate, are not necessarily considered opposites, but elements in an interlocking embrace. Merleau-Ponty advocates a kind of returning to the senses, an aesthetic education or re-education that undoes some ways of thinking. Consider Heine. Radio lectures collected as the world of perception. In these lectures, Merleau-Ponty considers how honey is a worldly phenomenon that blurs distinctions between alive and inanimate, reaching out versus being grabbed. Oh, sorry, part of that's gone. I didn't my talk, so I'll have to read it off the screen. So he says, honey is a slow-moving liquid. While it undoubtedly has certain consistency and allows itself to be grasped, it soon creeps slyly from the fingers and returns from where it started from. So this is the honey creeping, right? It comes apart as soon as it has been given a particular shape, and what is more, it reverses the rules by grasping the hands of whoever would take hold of it. Sounds like a horror film. The living exploring hand, which thought it could master this thing, instead discovers that it is embroiled in a sticky external object. Coming this summer. So the point here, and this is something where I think Merleau-Ponty is leaning not so much on Freud but on Piaget, and Piaget's idea that that children live in an animated world, right? So I might stub my toe against the table, but you don't say that to a kid. You say, "Why did that mean table hurt you?"
Yeah.
Bad table. I'm so sorry, right? And so he wants to say that this is not a way of thinking that we get rid of. That the idea that the world is sort of alive and coming after us or coming out to meet us subtends. That this undergoes our experience of the world. And so this is what phenomenology is going to be doing. It's going to be saying this is a reality. This is a reality that we need to sort of acknowledge and speak to. And to not do that doesn't quite speak to our experience, right? Or in a very sort of blanket way, which is a large problem with Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology in general. But next talk. Okay. You can't see the artist and photographer here. This is Blake Little, who was dousing people in honey and then making these gorgeous photos. So he says, honey is a particular way the world has of acting on me and my body. And this is what its various attributes do not simply, this is why its various attributes do not simply stand side by side, but are identical insofar as they all, what we can get out of that, or what I would like to sort of get out of that, is this idea of honey showing itself to you. Right? Of honey sort of going out and meeting you and showing you certain qualities of itself. And you can't really separate these, right? You can't just have the sweetness of the honey or the stickiness of the honey, or it's not honey, right? Honey is sweet, sticky, oozy, grippy, all these kinds of things. These are not qualities that are going to be separated. They have to be bound together. Merleau-Ponty, with talk of reversals in a world that not only looks back, but also returns to touch, these 1948 lectures anticipate the turns Merleau-Ponty grapples with in a posthumously, I can't even pronounce that, posthumously published collection of essays called The Visible and the Invisible. There, he writes, he who looks must not himself be foreign to the world he looks at. He uses this concept of flesh, which I'm going to explain briefly. Flesh, he wants to understand, is a kind of elemental part of the universe. There's earth, there's wind, there's fire, there's slime, the family stone, and there's flesh, right? The flesh is an element that he considers binds the universe together. Well, I think I wrote it better than I can say it right now, but I'll just leave it with that. So in the sense that flesh is a general thing, midway between the spatio-temporal individual and the idea, a sort of incarnate principle that brings a style of being wherever there's a fragment of being. The flesh is the sense of an element of being, right? Again, not something that I'm saying we're all going to understand right now, but I think we can understand flesh and being. He puts this together quite purposefully, right? The world sort of is flesh. And that's the way that he wants to bring together ideas of vision and touch, right? We can understand tables through vision and through touch because there's a way in which it's going to be reaching back to me, just like the honey does, he wants to say. Okay. So this is one way he puts this. I'm not going to spend time with that, but it's an image of Rodin. Skip ahead, sorry. Sorry. Post it online, you can look at it then. Okay. So he says, so to sort of interpret this idea of what he means by flesh as an element, all the world is flesh. You, me, honey, limestone, and marble, sticks and staffs, aliens and refugees. We can be seen, we can be touched, and we can show aspects of ourselves when we are felt and in how we feel. In his later work, Merleau-Ponty suggests that we derive a sense of life and self through our interaction with supposedly inanimate objects. Again, Merleau-Ponty writes, we situate ourselves, we situate ourselves in ourselves and in things, in ourselves and in the other, at the point where, by sort of chiasm or reversing structure, we become the others and we become world. We'll get there. But let's think about this fact that he wants to sort of think about who I am is not just something that I derive from a conversation with somebody, right? That is true, but that's something he handled, in the phenomenology of perception. Now he wants to say who I am as a living thing actually comes out of dealing with things that are not living, in a sense. To understand myself as a fleshy being, I have to sort of interact with things that are considered inanimate, and through that friction, through that interaction together, this is how I get a sense of living and non-living. We become others and we become world. And after this dissolution has transpired, in what way can we say that we are still ourselves? Merleau-Ponty suggests that aesthetic education involves a second unlearning. The first was the separation of opposites such as near and far and past and present. We have to view those as being together. Now we are encouraged to get over the division between other and self and world. It is here that I would like to turn to my final topic, that of guilt or culpability. Many of us yesterday had opportunity to practice contact improvisation with large waxwood staffs. I can have one, used in many styles of Kung Fu. Most of my previous experience with these staffs has been with their martial side, where the light weight allows for speed and flexibility, and the skin-like coating keeps it from splintering. But dancing with staffs allowed me to feel other qualities, or to hear the staff speak of itself in a way I had never previously heard. That same skin that kept my hands from receiving splinters also provides a frictional quality, similar to the slight sweat of human skin. There is a true delicacy to working with a staff that only exists because of its sturdiness. The same technique that allows one to spin and bash someone's head in can also brush a head up and then act as a fulcrum for a lift. Participants yesterday discussed how use of the staffs called upon a heightened sense of precision and decisiveness, of responsibility and support, of plotting, anticipating, and seeing the effects of actions. When manipulating a partner, the length of the staffs provides more room for her to move than CI couples often provide each other. That space opens out the precious friction of contact and could allow audiences to witness a tactile dialogue that is often buried beneath bodies on the floor of jams. That is, the contact dancing took on the qualities of the staff, and the staff took on the qualities of contact dancing. Through our dialogue, the staff becomes more like us, and we become more like the staff. We know each other better. I've known staffs for a long time, but treated them as weapons. They've often whispered other possibilities to me, and I am culpable for not listening. If I may be so bold as to argue with God, well, swords may abandon their roles in bloodletting without being beaten again into plowshares, just as spears do not need to be bent into pruning hooks in order for us to nourish each other, as we witnessed yesterday. And here I'm thinking of this really beautiful passage from Isaiah, looking towards the time of the coming of the Messiah. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. So sort of end of weapons. We can talk about that a little bit later. Kung Fu performances show another way forward. Here speed, precision, and ferocity all point toward beauty and prophesy a life of a spear where it may be seen and felt differently. The psychologist Abraham Maslow famously quipped, "I suppose it's tempting, if the only tool you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail." And shame on us if our practical know-how, if our working relationship, if the sweat that secretes through our play with the hammer does not feel its other possibilities. Against beating swords and warping spears, against the monotonous future of hammers, I would like to make the following argument.
Keep it.
Thank you very much. Opening the floor for questions, comments, more dances.
Just, a lovely presentation. The whole thing was really inspiring and beautifully put forward. And even for someone that's not an intellectual and doesn't read all this stuff, very easy for me to understand the points you
But
made.
you should explain it to me.
Yeah.
No, there's something about this that is very approachable. I hope. It shouldn't be coming out of life, right? It's a philosophy.
It's lovely to have it in the context of dancing as well. So often it's just about technique and all that kind of stuff. It's lovely to have this. It's like a real breath of fresh air. Appreciate it.
For me, there's something really exciting about the realm of imagination that's invoked in all of this. And I don't know how much Merleau-Ponty speaks about imagination per se. This perception it feels like he's speaking around it or evoking it somehow through.
Yeah, I'd say two things. One thing is, insofar as we would consider imagination sort of secluded within the brain, he doesn't want to think that way. And he's very interested in sort of not thinking, like how is it that sort of you can do a lot of things, you can brush your teeth and put a shoe on and things like that, but without really thinking at all. So this is a sort of fully integrated bodily intelligence. When he talks about imagination, he sort of circles back around towards the visible and invisible, and that's part of the invisible, is imagination, poetry, things that he feels like undergird and sort of are the sediments of the visible world, but that aren't necessarily seen in the same sort of way. And I have to say, it's not something I know tons about.
But it sounds really interesting to already locate imagination as outside of the brain, or outside of the body, or as something in maybe this space between, or the encounter of the flesh, fleshy encounter with the world.
And is that somehow connected as well to what you're sort of saying about, like, you go and you just seeing your sick friend in bed in the hospital, and then you're on the train. So we're used to including the things that aren't there in the things that are there. So imagination is something like that too. It's not about, figments of the imagination. It's also about our possibility to include things that aren't necessarily so present, but we can make present or feel present.
It's violently, I think I would say. So, I think Merleau-Ponty would say something like, you are there, right? And the person is with you, and I can look at you and tell, right? And so there's a way in which, the sort of delicacy that you might have around the person who's there. I mentioned something about sort of a hyper-awareness to like some sorts of noises if you're concerned about their breathing, but you might tune out a lot of other noises that don't matter quite as much. And I think in a way he wants to say this isn't really imagination, like you think you're there but you're not. He wants to say you are there and you're kind of not. You're not on the bus, you're not on the train.
So then maybe that's true of other feats of the imagination, which maybe you haven't just been with your sick friend, or the thing becomes present through your potential to be able to embody that thing, or to be able to experience that thing as if it were there.
Yeah. So I wrote in an article in Theatre Journal about grief, and this is one thing he talks about grief as sort of being a way of continuing a certain way of movement, even though the person who you're missing or who's departed isn't really there anymore. So you might sort of still set a table for two, or sleep on half of a bed, or do all these sorts of these daily ways of living, and that's a way of sort of maintaining the presence of a person. And this is what I mean. Like he tends to, when he talks about emotions and about things like that, he tends to sort of look at what's happening in terms of what are you doing, instead of what what are you thinking? You know, he's trying to get away from, trying too hard, one might say, but trying very hard to get away from the idea there's sort of a private life that goes on back here that can be quite separate from the way that you're moving around the world. He wants to try to put those together as well as he can.
My son, like last month, he's 6 years old, and he bumps into things and stuff. He gets so mad, he just starts beating up the table. And I'm saying this is just, he's really got a rich imagination, that this is kind of good or something. I find it kind of beguiling, like, wow, you know, like, why are you doing that to the chair? It was just there.
Yeah.
He's going to be a philosopher.
I mean, I'm not a real doctor, but I mean, along these lines, you could sort of invite him to sort of befriend the chair or table, you know, in a way that he might sort of a person, or sort of say, well, you know, you're in my way. What are we going to do about this? Or we have to do that, right? I don't have conversations with tables necessarily verbatim, but I might say every time I come into the office, I want my knee on this, so I'm going to move, or I'm going to do something different about my pattern of movement, you know, so that doesn't happen anymore.
Well, maybe I'll kind of get us together with the chair.
That's a pattern intervention.
But it also be saying, like, as we get more rational, we're losing imagination.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's moves towards like what they're calling new materialism now, which is old materialism that academics discovered. But this is the way people are thinking. I think we've heard it pop up a lot of times in conversations here, right, about sort of the pen that Corinna was talking about, or the rubber hand, steps, and what else? I mean, I feel like we've sort of been tapping around this a lot in the course of the conference. Okay, so yeah, this is.
Last question.
I have tried to read Merleau-Ponty and understand for my PhD actually, and I was just, as I was reading, I was feeling that I mentioned it earlier, that he describes, like somehow he idealizes somehow how we should be perceiving the world, and how we are kind of inhibited by the mind-body, the Cartesian body spirit, and that we perceive things as like compartmentalized. And do you believe that actually we are not so open to perceive the world as he describes it?
But I think Merleau-Ponty sort of speaks widely for a lot of people. Like we see a lot of, I mean, it's white male what we do, right? So we tend to sort of take our experience. Freud's another good example, and then sort of say, well, because I experienced this, we know that this is true for humanity, right? And I think that he's absolutely guilty of that in some ways. On the other hand, I still find him useful. It's like, okay, well, I don't want to go that route for you, but I do find something very interesting that you're talking about in the way you're trying to wrestle with this idea of animacy and empathy. And so, yeah, I would say, particularly as you get into light stuff, you have to sort of complete the thought of it, I feel. It doesn't make sense. These are working notes, you know, and he's sort of scratching through and thinking through it himself. And I feel free to, like, you know, riff off of it, because that's, he sort of just gives you a bit, and you have to kind of go somewhere with it.
It's a very creative way of seeing kind of creative things. It's kind of like where you may be seeking towards, especially the arts, but in everyday life as well. Somehow I feel like he describes things as if they are.
Yes. And it really, I mean, when you get into the arts, it's a good way of thinking, like the relationship you might have with, you know, that I have with my first pair of point shoes, or that somebody might have with, you know, a costume, or that you get with the fabric after you work with it a bit, or a stick, you know, because they are part of the show, right? And this is a way that they become real for you. You know, if you don't have that certain thing to go on the stage, it's like trying to go on stage without your partner. What am I going to do? I can't. I'm not me. I'm not the person I'm supposed to be there.
I'm so happy that we're running an hour over, because it means that we've had a really great day. And there's been so much that's come up, and it feels I feel very full, and I'm really looking forward also to our final presentation. And we will start at 5 o'clock. So we've got 15 minutes. Well, say 5 past 5. So thank you very much, everybody.